Have you ever worked so hard that you've missed meals? I'm talking about the kind of work that just takes over your life. I served for 5 years in the United States Marine Corps, and there was a saying we used to have, and it was this: if you worked a 12-hour day, that was a short day, because there were so many days that were 16 or 18 or even over 24 hours. The point is that work, even good work, is draining and depleting. And if you stick with me to the end of this video, I'm going to give you a strategy that Jesus gave us on how to rest. My name is JD.goding, and this is Understanding the Bible. And the reason that I started this channel was to take small amounts of biblical text and just mine the gold out of it. And the reason for that was so that your relationship with Jesus Christ would only improve. And if you wouldn't mind hitting that like and subscribe button, I'd really appreciate it, because it just helps get the message out further. Now, when it comes to rest, there's two groups of people that really come to mind. One is new parents, and two is people in ministry. During the stage of building a family, there is no end to the sleep-deprived nature of what's required of you. There's morning sickness, you're up at all hours of the day and night, there's laundry that has to be done, the kids need to be fed, and still the mortgage needs to be paid. And then there are those people who are in ministry, specifically pastors. They have a tough job. The hours are usually grueling. The people sometimes can be ungrateful, and there's the relentless week-to-week responsibilities that fall on their shoulders. Pastors are usually underpaid, and they're called to be with people at their worst times. So I'm talking ER visits, nursing home visits. They're the ones who are counseling people in the hardest moments of their life, and they're also the ones that have to keep the church running. It's a huge job. And it's in jobs like this where the topic of rest is so important, because the body and soul can only take so much until everything starts to break down. Now, in this portion of the gospel, the disciples have just returned to Jesus after being sent out 2 by 2. He had sent them out to cast out demons, to heal the sick, and to preach the gospel message. So them returning would have been a joyous event. I imagine that this would have been an absolute madhouse when this took place, because of all the power stories that they would have shared together, because Jesus gave them authority to do these things. And I would also acknowledge that this excitement in some way was probably dampened because John the Baptist had just been executed by King Herod while they were out on this mission. You see, the disciples were out spreading the gospel while John was in prison. And the reason John was in prison was because he was calling out an immoral and incestual relationship that the king had with his brother's wife. You see, King Herod had married Herodias, who was his stepniece. And John, being an Old Testament prophet, was calling out that sin just like he should have been. But a long story short, what happened was it was Herod's birthday, and Herodias, the wife of Herod, hated John the Baptist. And she picked her time and place perfectly. And she basically forced Herod's hand into executing John and then having his head served to him on a silver platter. Now, John died alone in prison, but when Jesus talks about this man in Matthew, he says, "Truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has arisen no one greater than John the Baptist." We aren't told when the disciples were actually told of this news, but it's a good assumption to think that they probably knew about this when they got back together with Jesus. But even though this horrific death had taken place, there was still a time to rejoice, because of all the good things that had happened because of Jesus sending the disciples out 2 by 2. In verse 30, it says, "The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught." It seemed like there was a predetermined time and place for them to meet up. And when they did that, they would have come together and shared stories. And you can imagine Jesus just sitting back and listening to each one of these guys explain how the power of God moves so powerfully through them. It would have been one of the coolest things to witness sitting in that circle of men. There would have been stories of demons coming out of people simply because they used the name of Jesus over them. There would have been stories of chronic illness being cured because the disciples laid their hands on people. And then there's the people who had responded to the message of the gospel. I think it would have been one of the best days, because they would have been face to face with Jesus, telling them all of these things that he had given them the authority and power to do. Now, I remember praying for one of our top YWAM leaders way back in the day. And I had just come out of the military, so my mindset was I was just a private and I'm talking to a general. And so I walked up to him, and I had noticed that he had a problem with his arm. And he told me that, yeah, his rotator cuff was torn. And I said, "Can I just pray for you?" And he said yes. And so I just put my hand on his shoulder and I prayed for him. And about a minute or two later, he was swinging his arm around because Jesus supernaturally healed him. Now, at that time, I was brand new into missions, and I had never seen Jesus' power in action like that before. And what we did was we went and told everybody, and what it did was it elevated the faith of everybody around us. So people started praying for everybody that was sick. And I think that's what happened here. As each disciple would have shared, their faith level would have risen and risen and risen. And this would have happened in spite of hearing the news about John the Baptist. In verse 31, it says, "And he came to them, 'Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going so that they had no leisure, not even to eat. And they went away in a boat to a desolate place by themselves.'" As the stories came to a close that night, it was apparent to Jesus that these boys were exhausted, both physically and spiritually. They needed relief from the whirlwind of toil that they had just gone through. And what they needed was to be physically and spiritually revived so that they could continue to fight another day. You know, after being surrounded by like an undisclosed amount of people for so long, for praying for the sick, casting demons out of people, and preaching the word, this would have taken it out of the disciples. And Jesus realized this. He realized that they needed rest. There's only so much a person can do, both physically and spiritually, before the wheels start to fall off. And this is why rest is so important. One night when I was on the Bellawood, I was completely exhausted. We were working 12 on, 12 off, and the only way that we knew what time it was based on meal times. We lost track of days. We lost track, is it night, is it morning? It's a weird position to be in. And those of you guys that are Marines or in the Navy, you'd understand what I'm saying. But one night I went up topside and I went to the flight deck and I just laid down and looked at the stars. You know, it's blackout conditions. There's not a light anywhere around. And I was able to see the sky perfectly clear, like Abraham would have seen it way back when. And I stayed there for about 30 minutes. And it was just enough of a rest to get back up and to continue my shift. I also remember what it's like to have young kids. I have 4 of them myself. And when they were young, the demands on us as parents were enormous. I mean, we both had to do the jobs that were required of us, but inside the home, you have to do things like change the diapers, and you have to do laundry, and you have to continually pick up the house. You have to make the meals. It gets to a place where you're absolutely redlining. And for those that are in ministry, the last 20 years has taught me a lot, specifically for pastors. A pastor or minister is not able to look back on his day's work like a carpenter can. You know, a carpenter can look back on what he built and feel that feeling of satisfaction. Pastor can't. You know, he gives a sermon on Sunday. Well, guess what? Next Sunday's coming. But how do we rest in the moment? Well, there are some answers like taking a Sabbath or maybe a vacation from time to time. For a single family, an answer might be you need to call someone to come over and just help. For a pastor, the answer might be you need to relinquish or distribute some of your responsibility to other people in your church so that you have time to rest. The fact of the matter is there's a million different ways to get away and rest, but which one is the right one? And what I'd say to that is this. These are the questions that need to be brought to Jesus. It was Jesus who saw the disciples' exhaustion. He saw their joy when they reported back to him all the things that had happened, and he probably saw their tears when they heard that John had been killed. And the result of all of that, Jesus says, "Come away with me to a desolate place." So my main takeaway is this. We need to sit with Jesus in prayer. We need to do this just like the disciples did, because Jesus is the one with all wisdom, and it's Jesus who is going to lead you to that place of rest. Thanks, and I hope this helps.